Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Chartered Accountants Ireland Ulster Society Rebooting the Economy 1 year on webinar. My name is Mark Lawther and I'll be your host today. It's been a real different year. The coronavirus pandemic has been unprecedented on the impact it has had on the way we live our lives and has led to many changes to the economy and wider society, which none of us could have predicted a year ago. So speaking of that, pretty much a year ago, we asked our three panellists today, Conor Lambe, Chief Economist with Danske Bank, Neil Gibson, the Chief Economist for EY Ireland, and Gareth Hetherington, the Director of Ulster University Economic Policy, to share their views on what was needed to reboot the economy in this new world. So we're delighted to have them back today to give us some insight into their views, what might have changed over the year, and what they think their focus should be. So we are recording the session today and a link will be sent to you afterwards. If you'd like to put any questions to the panelists, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll try and put as many of them as we can to people. So I'm going to kick off with Conor. You recently released your Northern Ireland quarterly sector focus and in order to upgrade your economic growth focus, perhaps you can give us some insights into that today.
Hi Mark, thanks very much and good afternoon everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Yes, we've recently published our economic forecasts for Northern Ireland at Danske Bank and we have upgraded our projections. And so I'll maybe just give a few remarks about what we've seen with regards to the economy at the first part of 2021 and then some of the factors that we expect to impact the Northern Ireland economy over the rest of this year and into 2022. So over the first part of this year, as we're all aware, we've been in a lockdown period that began on Boxing Day, so at the end of 2020. And that being the case, it's likely that we're going to see a contraction in economic activity in Northern Ireland at the start of this year. We're probably going to see the same across the wider UK economy as well. But there are some early signs for optimism. And so as we start looking forward, one of the big factors and probably the key determinant of economic performance is the expected gradual easing of the coronavirus restrictions. We've seen the recent announcements around some of the dates that parts of the economy may be opening. Coronavirus case numbers are much lower than they were at the early part of this year. And the vaccine programme in Northern Ireland has rolled out very successfully over the last few months. And that being the case, we're hopeful that the gradual easing of the restrictions will take place over the weeks and months ahead. And the economy, while likely to contract in Q1, should return to positive rates of growth from the second quarter of this year onwards. And that's really driven by that easing of the restrictions. But I think it's also important to note that economic policy actions will have a key role to play in facilitating the recovery. So over the last year or so, the policy steps taken by government and by the Bank of England have played a very important role in supporting people and businesses to manage the disruption of the pandemic. But as we look forward, they'll play an important role in supporting and facilitating the economy to come back to growth. So if we just look at, for example, over the last few weeks, we've had the furlough scheme extended as part of the Chancellor's budget until September of this year. We also saw the super deduction tax policy announced to try and encourage businesses to bring forward some investment plans. In the years after the financial crisis, business investment across the whole of the UK took a long time to recover. And I think the Chancellor is hoping to avoid something similar after this crisis by bringing in that policy to try and encourage businesses to invest now. So that's providing hopefully some support to business investment. And locally, the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland has published its Economic Recovery Action Plan, which focuses on skills, on R&D and innovation, on the transition to a greener economy, and on trade, investment and exports, all key building blocks of what we want our economy to look like as we move forward. The Bank of England are also maintaining interest rates at their historic low of just 0.1%, and I think they'll probably stay there throughout the rest of this year, and that's creating an environment which is supportive of people and businesses as well. So those economic policy measures, both fiscal policy from the UK government, measures here in Northern Ireland and monetary policy from the Bank of England will all play a role in supporting the recovery. But I think there's a few factors that could hold back the pace of economic growth as well. Despite the extension of the furlough scheme, I do unfortunately still think we're going to see a rise in unemployment. It may not be as high as we thought it was going to be a year ago when we last spoke, and it'll probably come towards the latter part of this year when the furlough scheme ends. But if we have less people working, then the amount of goods and services that we can produce in the economy will of course be smaller, and so that will hold back the pace of growth somewhat. I also think we'll see some people and businesses behaving somewhat cautiously. So as we start to open up, hopefully we will see consumers spend and businesses invest. But there will be people, perhaps those who have been on furlough and had their income squeezed, or who are still very much impacted by the uncertainty around the pandemic, who might just decide to hold back a bit on how much they're prepared to spend. While some businesses who had to run down their cash reserves or take on a lot of debt over the last year may decide to try and rebuild up some of that cash or pay back some of those borrowings rather than start investing for future growth straight away. So there might be a bit of caution there. And we have the extra trade frictions related to Brexit that a lot of firms are still working through the implications of. Across the board, our expectation now is that the Northern Ireland economy will grow by about 4.8% in 2021. And that's up from an expectation of about 4% at the time of our last report in January. So some encouraging signs that have led us to upgrade our forecasts. And we think next year growth will be about 5.8%. So a couple of years of reasonably strong growth, but we think it'll probably be the second half of next year before economic activity levels are back at where they were prior to the pandemic. And then I think just to touch on a few different sectors of the economy, in terms of the fastest growth rates this year, we think it's probably going to be the consumer-focused businesses like hospitality and arts and entertainment that post the fastest percentage rates of growth. But it's really important to contextualize that, and that's coming off those sectors experiencing the biggest falls in 2020. And so even though as the restrictions are eased in those sectors, we might see almost like a type of rebound sort of effect that gives them quite a strong rate of growth in percentage terms, it's still probably only going to represent a partial recovery in activity levels for those sectors compared to what they would have known prior to the pandemic. For sectors like manufacturing, construction, I think they'll probably grow a little bit faster than the overall economy, and that's partly because they've sort of been able to stay open during the first part of this year, so the restrictions haven't had the same impacts there as they've had in some other sectors. And so I think they'll grow a bit faster than the overall economy. For sectors like professional services and ICT, I think they'll grow at a similar rate to the economy this year. They've been able to avoid some of the big drops in output as they've been able to adapt to remote working a little bit more easily than other sectors. And traditionally, they were quite strong performers in Northern Ireland prior to the pandemic. So as we're moving through 2022 and beyond, I expect them to reassert themselves as some of the strongest performers. And then I would just touch as well, perhaps on the retail sector. Again, we see growth this year, but it's probably not going to be as strong a rate of growth as those other consumer-focused industries because it didn't have as big a drop last year. And that's because some factors like the shift to online shopping and the continued operation of essential retail have given a little bit of support to that particular sector. But hopefully as we move through this year and into next year, we will see sectors growing again and starting on that journey to recovery. And that's what our latest forecasts are expecting.
Thank you for that, Conor. 2020, we also saw a big impact on consumer confidence, and that led to the restrictions. How do you see that moving out in 2021 and helping us build back?
Yeah, so I think consumer confidence is going to be a really important part of the recovery. Our most recent Danske Bank Consumer Confidence Index was for the final quarter of 2020. And what we saw then was confidence levels increasing compared to where they were in Q3, but still a bit lower than they were at the end of 2019 before the pandemic began. One of the big drivers of that improvement in confidence over the quarter was the positive news that was coming out of the vaccine programme towards the end of last year. And so it was encouraging to see that. I think we need to hope as we go through this year that consumer confidence picks up and gradually builds. And we know that when consumers are feeling more confident, they're typically more willing to spend. So I mentioned how some people may still be a bit cautious this year. In overall terms, I do think consumer spending will be pretty strong this year, probably grow a little bit faster in Northern Ireland than the overall economy will. And that will hopefully be supported by rising confidence levels. But so much is going to depend just on the impacts of the pandemic as we go through this next few months and the economy starts to reopen again. But I think our hope is that confidence among consumers, but also among businesses, builds as we move through the year, and that will hopefully help the economic recovery really take hold.
Okay, thank you very much for that insight, Conor. I'm going to move on to Neil now. So you have a few figures coming out next week that cover the whole of the island of Ireland, and I believe your report will focus on the prospect of inflation and some interesting figures on that. Perhaps you give some insight into that, Neil.
Thank you, Mark, and hello everyone. Nice to be back again a year on. And I must say, I sit here, it's been a very traumatic year, very, very difficult. We'll all know people who've suffered terribly, either commercially or in their personal lives, and we should never underscore that or trivialize it. But I must say, from an economics point of view, I sit here perhaps a little bit better mood than I expected I would be. Some things have performed better than we imagined. Conor's already mentioned unemployment not quite reached the peaks we feared, and even with the end of furlough, it's not expected to reach those levels that we were originally fearing. House prices have held up, which helps confidence. Share prices have held up, which again helps people's confidence. So I would frame my remarks here by saying that we may have done a rather better job than I maybe feared in terms of holding the economy together over this traumatic period to pass on that baton of growth back to the consumer. And as long as we don't mess up that changeover, then that looks a bit more optimistic than we'd thought. And we too have revised up our forecasts a little bit. As you say, Mark, the report focuses about what the price of this recovery will be, and do we have the prospect of increasing prices coming? And I think I'm going to, in a couple of remarks here, I'm going to give you some of the reasons that I would be pretty positive about the future, but I think it's right to set out some of the risks we've got here. And before I get to the prices, a couple of things. One is the inequality point that's going to be linked to prices. So we are not going to see a recovery that will work for everybody. We will see some structural change. Conor's mentioned it. Will business tourism be back to the way it ever was? Will high street retail look the same? Some real structural changes will leave some individuals, some business owners really struggling and may not even be viable from a business point of view. And that's going to be pretty difficult. So we have some real scarring effects. Think of our children who've been out of school for a period of time. Think of some of the loneliness questions for some of the elderly. Think of some of the mental health questions. Think of even some of the performance issues that management teams and leadership teams have when they haven't that same time to interact and be together to come up with good ideas. A little bit of creativity challenge there. So scarring effects are one. Every day of lockdown is something that carries a cost with it, and those costs are not just incremental, they become pretty exponential. We don't have a great sense of discipline at the moment. Now, that seems an odd thing to say, but if you think of coming out of the previous recessions, nobody would want us to be into an austerity journey. But that gives you a real sense of there's a finite amount of money. That's not the perception at the moment. There's a feeling you can just print money. And that does lead to potentially things like you see in the report, the Irish Fiscal Council have already begun to warn the government that they're beginning to put in pay rises and things into the system that are not directly COVID linked and therefore might have an amplifying effect on prices. There's a perception now that whatever scale of problem, there's money that could be printed for it, and that's quite a dangerous place to be in. But as you mentioned, Mark, one of the features of the report is this prospect of whether inflation might be something we're going to have to deal with for the first time in a very long time. Now, there's a great, for all the economic nerds out there, go and watch the Larry Summers, Paul Krugman debate recently about whether inflation is something we should be worried about or not. The jury's out. But all I would say is that there's a really strong set of conditions out there that could drive prices. So you have booming world economy, you have rising commodity prices, oil, foodstuffs, for example, as a result of that. You have firms looking to rebuild their balance sheet. You have a lot of spending coming through from the consumer side that's been pent up. You have social distancing costs, Brexit paperwork costs, all of that. Many people in firms, public service workers, people who have coped well, relatively speaking, or been very busy, I should say, during this pandemic, really making the case for some reward in their pay. And that does have the potential to really ramp up prices. Now, if you have a lot of debt, a bit of inflation isn't the worst thing. But again, it adds to the inequality problem if those people who don't have a rising income are facing rising prices. So keep an eye on that. And certainly our advice to all our clients is to keep an eye on the state of prices and know where you can make choices to keep your costs down. But I don't want to, just in the last 2 minutes here, I don't want to give a too gloomy a perspective. Just 3 quick takeaways that we feature in our report that give me a little bit more optimism. Number 1, this has been a great year for learning about the art of the possible. We can really turn the attention that we've put to COVID to some other big societal questions, tackling some of those other big problems, and we know many of them in Northern Ireland. Economic inactivity, it could be low skills for some people, it could be obesity crisis, it could be congestion. You can think about what's possible to do. R&D is back in fashion. People are thinking about the value of research, of science and innovation and thinking differently. The public policy direction, as Conor mentioned, is moving to support. Corporate tax might be going up in the future, but there's more R&D tax credits. So be innovative, solve problems, think creatively seems to be the message. That resurgence of science and R&D to a region that's strong in certain areas there, a very good university network with some very strong research components, is actually something should play to our strengths. And really, that's the kind of, art of the possible, science and R&D. But the third takeaway, the one that gives me the most hope in a way, is it does feel like we're entering a new era of innovation and investment. The policy direction is to encourage problem solving, innovation, R&D tax credits, etc. But governments too are now worried about chip shortages for cars from certain markets, Suez canals getting blocked, trade difficulties and tariffs. That's leading firms and governments to say, I don't want all the vaccine production in one market. I don't want all of my eggs in one basket. I want a different set of options for getting my supplies. And that's leading to lots of firms looking at new locations to invest into, new places to put down these multinodal investment strategies. And that breaking up of the monopolies in where you produce produce or provide services from presents a new era of opportunity. And if Northern Ireland, and Brexit's a controversial subject, but if that protocol even does so much as to make us a curiosity to certain investors to think about, I wonder, is there anything in that for me? If we can get onto the short list as a region, then all those other strengths of quality of life, cost of living can come into play to drive a little bit of a new era of investment. So tough climate, and I don't want to underplay that, Mark. We might be beginning to see the foothills of some price rises we've got to be mindful of. But there are some real things around science, policy changes, and even investment that maybe give us a little bit of optimism for that forward-looking position for the Northern Ireland economy.
Your numbers look across the island of Ireland. Neil, do you see differences in how the north and the south will be impacted and will grow back better?
Yes, there's definitely, as is always the case in the data, the truth lies below the headlines. On the face of it, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was the fastest growing economy in the world last year. Northern Ireland, one of the slower ones, plus 3.5 for Ireland, minus 10 for Northern Ireland, which means for the flip side of that happens in the bounce back, where Northern Ireland grows a bit faster this year than the Republic. But actually, if you pick away the data, the domestic economy, the government sector, the consumer sector, so how we as citizens feel the economy, the money we have to spend and the money that's spent on our behalf, has been very, very similar. So as almost always the case, there's much more in common between the two economies than there is differences. But one important difference that does exist is the Irish economy has a big export base. Not only is it a large export base, it's focused on pharma, ICT and agri-food, almost a perfect hat trick for sectors you'd want to deal with a pandemic. So they have such a strong export performance, it's holding up their tax base, giving them a little bit more leeway on how they can spend. Now, UK and Ireland will have to think about correcting the public finances in time, but this gives them nothing like the difficulties they had coming out of the last recession. They're very going to have the ammunition, if you will, or the government firepower to do more than it was able to do in the past. So we should see continued strong growth in the Republic of Ireland, but already there's the concerns about rising house prices and cost showing it's coming up and peaking there. So the labour markets look similar. The domestic economies look similar. There's a little bit of strength there in Ireland around the export base that Northern Ireland lacks in scale. But I think we're both going to see these new innovation potentials. So many of our clients are saying to us, I want a base in Europe and into the UK. And what better place to think about doing that than the island of Ireland, when you can have a presence in both north and south and cover both of those bases. So even some potential from an island perspective that we might see some new interest in it as an investment location.
Thank you for that, Neil. So moving on then to Gareth. So both Conor and Neil have talked about unemployment and the impact that this has on various sectors. And I know Ulster University looks at the labour market statistics, so I'd be keen to get your views on those who have been hardest hit by this pandemic and those impacts might be permanent rather than temporary.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back again this year, even if it is in a virtual format. But we should be very grateful that we have the technology that allows us to do this. From an economics perspective, I think we're consistent with the comments from both Conor and Neil. We're somewhat more optimistic about economic performance than would have been the case just a few months ago. But I'm going to make just a couple of comments, as Mark said, before we get into the Q&A, and obviously they focus on the impact of the pandemic. Firstly, those mostly impacted. We did some research on this quite recently, and the pandemic has had a much more significant impact on some groups in society than on others. And there was a quote I saw some months ago, which I think sums it up very well, which is, we're all facing the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I suppose there's three groups that have been most impacted. First is young people. And although they're the least impacted from a health perspective, they've been amongst the most impacted from an economic perspective. And we estimated that at its peak, just under half of those under 25 who were in employment were either furloughed or laid off, just under half. Compare that to approximately a quarter of those who were over 45. I think Neil also touched on this. Young people's education skills development has also been very severely impacted when we think about availability of apprenticeship opportunities, placements, access to practical training courses, which cannot be delivered online, whether that's in FE or HE. That's all been very significantly reduced, and we haven't seen the impact of that. We haven't experienced the full outworkings of that impact on skills development. So that's the first group, young people. The next group then is lower earners and lower skilled people. And again, at its peak, we estimated around 40 to 50% of those with low-level qualifications and at the bottom end of the earnings spectrum were likely to be furloughed or laid off, compared to just 10% of the top earners. And so we've seen a much larger proportion of people with high-level qualifications able to work from home. I mean, dare I say it, and I'm talking to the Institute of Chartered Accountants, this group here, people with higher level qualifications, if we're honest, we're able to work from home by and large, and our income has been largely unaffected. We need to contrast that with people working in jobs that require low-level qualifications, such as in retail and hospitality. Many of those jobs, obviously, you can't do or deliver from home. And in the third group, there's actually a very interesting gender dynamic that occurred through COVID. Initially, men were more likely to be furloughed when restrictions were introduced initially. But sectors such as construction and manufacturing returned to work very quickly. And those are very male-dominated employment sectors, so men returned to work more quickly. Women much more likely to be on furlough for a longer period of time. And again, when we think of some of the sectors in lockdown for that longer period of time, in the close contact services, for example, hairdressers, beauticians, they tend to be much more female-dominated employment sectors. So different groups of society impacted in different ways. And then also want to talk a little bit just about the labour market. We've done a little bit more work, and so overall the labour market has held up much more strongly than many had anticipated, ourselves included. At its peak last year, approximately 240,000 jobs were furloughed in Northern Ireland, 30% of total employee jobs. Now, as restrictions eased over the summer, that then fell to a low of 65,000 in September. But then obviously we went back into lockdown, and we're back up over 100,000 people on furlough. Now, one thing that is encouraging is that the numbers supported are less than half than at peak levels, despite us being still in strict public health restrictions mode, and those restrictions still being in place. So now this is primarily a result of more businesses being able to adapt to the restrictions and continue trading, albeit perhaps in a reduced way. But I think there's a big question now about what happens when furlough ends, and I suppose there's a risk that 2020 could be seen as the year which saw unemployment postponed rather than unemployment avoided. And as the government supports, as the furlough scheme in particular begins to taper, firms could start the process of making significant numbers of their staff redundant. Now, under the current furlough scheme, employers will have to start to contribute 10% to salaries in July, and then 20% in August and September, after which the scheme is scheduled to end. But since November 2020, employers have had to meet the cost of national insurance contributions and pension contributions for their furloughed staff. So I guess intuitively, that would have been the point when you would have thought firms would have started the process of letting their staff go. So therefore, I suppose it's encouraging that a spike in unemployment did not occur at that time. And then there's also some encouragement from the vacancy and new hire data provided. Although the number of vacancies obviously fell very significantly in the first half of 2020, it has recovered, and the vacancy rate in Northern Ireland now is around 80%, 79% of the 2019 average. And the new hire data is also positive. There were approximately 24,000 new hires in Q4 2020, and that's down just, and I say just, but that's down just 13% on Q4 2019. So we have we've got vacancies sitting at about 80% of where it was pre-pandemic, and we have hire data around 90% of where we were pre-pandemic, and we're still in lockdown. So there are job opportunities available for those who will not return to work after furlough. So that's all good. But I suppose a word, and it's a major word of caution, I think, is required, because when we look at the high levels of demand are in areas such as engineering, ICT, healthcare, logistics, and we contrast that with the levels of vacancies in areas such as retail, catering and hospitality are well below pre-pandemic levels. There's a real risk, a very significant skills mismatch between the areas of the economy that may lose jobs and the areas of the economy where jobs are going to be created. So that in turn, and I suppose as a policy centre, we're focused on, well, what could and should government do? And I think the two areas, one, I think there's going to be a serious need for job search supports and also assistance to reskill and upskill in order to reallocate labour from sectors that may need to let people go to other sectors that are in growth. So overall, things have been better than we thought, but we're still not out of the woods yet. But grounds for some optimism.
Thank you. And you talked, obviously, then looking at the policy changes that have come through over the year. What's your view on how effective they have been to date? And do you think, as we build forward into those new policies, think we can learn anything from how quickly they have been implemented?
Well, there's a number of policies that are obviously operated or delivered at the national level. So the furlough scheme is the obvious example of that. And then there are also a range of policies that the local executive have put in place. And one that I happen to be involved in doing some of the research around was extending rates relief for businesses in the sectors most impacted. I mean, I think in terms of lessons moving forward, where government officials should be very much commended is the speed with which they were able to put a lot of those schemes together, whether that's at both the national or the local level. And I suppose there's a double-edged sword here. On one level, that gives us confidence that we can start to implement new policies in other areas, such as, let's say, health reform or other areas of urban regeneration reform, whatever reform agenda you want to pick, that we can move forward at the same pace. And there's maybe some optimism that can happen. But I think we also have to recognize that there are a lot of people who have been working incredibly hard over the last 12 months to deliver that, and that's not really sustainable in the longer term. And I suppose we need to be sympathetic and understanding to what is realistic realistic to expect from the public sector and from government in a non-emergency situation. We've all been responding to an emergency. We've had a high level of incentive to be able to meet the challenges of that emergency. But in a non-emergency situation, expecting people, let's say even in this institution, in a university, expecting lecturers to move everything online over the course of 3 or 4 weeks would only have happened in an emergency. It wouldn't happen in a normal circumstance. So I think we need to balance what is achievable and with what we would want to achieve in the longer term.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. So we're going to move to some questions, and if you have any, please feel free to put those in the question and answer chat box at the bottom, and I'll try and put them all, as many as I can, to the panelists. So I'm going to move to Neil there. Gareth picked up on some interesting concepts around building back better and using the emergency situation. Do you find businesses are adapting exactly the same and they're planning similar to those things?
Yes, it's been a year of, as I say, against a very traumatic backdrop. It's been a year in which there's been a lot of inspirational tales of what firms can do and at what pace. So whether that's pivoting to providing PPE equipment or whether it's just something like bringing a whole office to work from home and working out the security and data protection requirements for that. Now, that's really led a lot of firms to go back into some of their agendas around hastening their digital progress, their flexible working agenda, their work anytime, any place mentality. Lots of things that have been, sort of reminds me of when I was, this will tell you when I was educated, when people were talking about the paperless office that never quite came, except it sort of has now. And that is an example of a change that we talked about, and we've done the same about digital progress or nimble or agile working. And yet sitting in the car on the way in the morning, you would have been cursing the traffic every day and saying, why does everybody have to come in at the same time? And this is now a real opportunity to move some of that permanently forward, to say, my digital agenda's progressed, my flexible working agenda's progressed, my looking at new supply chains, looking at new places has all triggered maybe was more achievable than we thought. So we've got a lot of ingenuity and creativity, both from the young, we're lucky to run an Entrepreneur of the Year program, fabulous stories of people running a business completely different to the business they thought they were going to run because the demand has changed, to the biggest of corporations completely changing their business model. But I think what's been most interesting to me in all this is lots of firms, EY's no different, wrestling with how to deal best with getting their staff's opinions and what's working for them and what's not. And that improvement in communication is quite important because we're starting to get new voices coming through and we're hearing messages that perhaps we hadn't thought. So you get a lot of thinking about, we don't need to be back in the office, you can do, but who's making those calls? We're hearing loud and clear from our young staff that they love to be in around other people. They learn best proximate to people. So it's been as much an emotional as a digital learning experience this last 12 months to say, we can see what we can do digitally, accelerate that, but what doesn't work so well and can be done, needs to be done, this balance of emotional and digital. And that's been the thing to me that I've taken from this, is that learning is about, yes, accelerating your ideas, about putting in new innovations, new ways of working, new ways of thinking, but it's also listening to more and more diverse voices, different ages, different perspectives, different nationalities, different genders, all those different perspectives. And almost every client we talk to is using new platforms to engage with their staff, more feedback, more, is this working for you? Is that not? And that's a real area of innovation, that kind of workforce planning and how you actually go about getting your organization. So that's a positive that we're seeing. So firms are definitely embracing these concepts of agility, nimbleness, flexibility, pivoting into new areas. But I also think, and I mentioned it earlier about prices, there are still some fundamentals out there, price points, costs still matter. Lots of big strategic reviews going on now about what sort of office footprint do we need? Where do we need it? What sort of supply chain protections do we need? We've hardly mentioned Brexit, coupled with the complexities that brings. I think this is a time of change. And I think Gareth made a very good point. You also have to remember that capacity has a limitation too. So a big message coming loud and clear from our clients and our staff is you need to recharge periods, and entrusting young staff to have the discipline to work from home, but not keep the computer on late, not answer emails at all. Those are important skills too, that we have to help people. You can't expect everyone to adapt as quickly as maybe some others do. So I think that's been a big takeaway for me, is nimbleness, agility, and flexibility, yes, but also an era perhaps of more listening and empowerment. And I think that can only be a good thing for how firms go about their decision making.
Neil picked up on the need for office space and the footprint of that. How are you seeing that, and how is Danske responding to that?
So I think the office space one's an interesting question. It was one of the things that I was watching back on when we spoke about this a year ago. And I've been on a few of these webinars over the last year or so, and it was a common question asked in the polls whenever people were asked, what would you like to do? And the consensus seemed to be people saying they would like to do a few days a week in the office and a few days a week at home. And that feels like for a lot of people it might be quite an enjoyable way for them to work, because they can cut out some of the things like commuting that they have to do every day, but yet still have the benefits of going into the office. I agree with some of the points that Neil made there around, certainly for younger people and people at the early stages of their career, the amount that they learn from being in the office. But I think as well, just as we move forward and people naturally start to move between businesses again, to change jobs again, to need to go into new organizations and meet new people, that can be quite difficult if you're not in the office to actually do it. It's a bit like the question of, are we ever going to have a Christmas party again? Because in 3 or 4 years' time, if we're all working from home, we'll actually never have met any of the people that we work with. So I think it's one of these things where there's probably a happy balance to be found there of how do we still get together as a team, do that creative thinking, build the personal relationships that allow teams to work really well together. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that so many businesses have been able to get through this past 12 months in the way that they have, because they had strong teams that had been built up in those close personal relationships that enabled them to operate so effectively in such difficult and different working environment. And so if we move forward from here, I don't think we want to lose that. So yes, there's probably some things we can still do in the virtual world to create those relationships and that strong team ethic and team morale. But a large part of that is going to come from actually having people together again. So I think are we going to completely move back to having everybody in the office 5 days a week permanently again? Perhaps not. Some businesses will, but some might decide that they're going to move to a type of hybrid model. But I think the focus should be on how do we get the best of both worlds, and understanding that may impact different people, and whether it's based on how long into the company they are, and what their new role is, or what their role in the organization might be, whether that has changed. that may be different for different people in the organisation. And so it's just thinking through those impacts. One size fits all probably isn't the answer here.
Mark, just very briefly on that, we've all gone on a bit of a journey in terms of our attitude towards the office since lockdown. And I saw recently KPMG have a CEO pulse survey they do regularly. And last month, so March 2021, they asked their CEOs, 17% said that they were considering reducing the size of their office footprint. So that's quite a big number, 17% in March. They asked the same question of the CEOs in August 2020, and it was 69% were considering reducing the size of their office footprint. So initially it was this very exciting thing, real way to reduce costs, cut out the commute, etc., etc. But all the things that Conor and Neil talked about there, about the need for us, we're social animals, and the need for us to be in physical proximity for a period of time is something that has come to the fore. So we're not going to go back exactly how we were before, but it's probably going to be a whole lot closer to how it was before than how it is now.
Obviously, people's working from home environments have impacted a lot of people's thoughts on that. And I know I'm going to come to you, Gareth, first for this question before we go to Conor. We had the question last time around house prices. I know, Gareth, you've done some research and transactions, and I don't think any of us could have believed the year that was for house transactions last year, myself included, and Conor has moved house too. So perhaps you can give us some insight to that, which gives Conor time to think about his response to the question that he knows coming.
Okay, yeah, so we've been doing some work for Land and Property Services to try to estimate transaction volumes moving forward. And it's turned out to be actually a really, really tricky piece of work, because historically transaction volumes and prices have been very closely aligned with economic activity. So let's take the financial crisis, for example. You had a significant reduction in economic activity, and that brought down both house prices, residential house prices, and transaction volumes. So we move forward now to 2020, and we've got similar things. We've had a very significant reduction in economic activity, and we've seen a very significant reduction in transaction volumes. But over the last 12 months, house prices have gone up. So what's happened there? And that is because the linkage between economic performance and house prices has been broken by the pandemic. The reason for the previous contractions in economic activity, the previous recessions, have had a fundamental economic base, or there's been a financial crisis, something fundamentally wrong with the economy that tipped it into recession. That didn't happen this time. That it was in response, it was a government mandated lockdown in response to a health emergency, a global health emergency. And so therefore, when we did all our initial assessments, and it was all pointing to a very significant reduction moving forward in transaction volumes and a fall in prices. But that actually didn't, whenever we were looking at it, it didn't make sense, because whenever the restrictions are lifted and it's physically possible for government departments and legal firms, etc., to process transactions, that will then return. And so moving forward, there's a lot happening within the residential space, and the data on the extent to which people are really moving out of city centres into bigger rural areas, that data is still hard to get a grip on. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I suppose in my world, anecdotes aren't evidence. I'm still looking for the data to support that. But I think what will happen is I do think that house prices will be where I don't see any sort of significant reduction in house prices. And I do see transaction volumes picking up again. The big issue in the housing market at the minute is a supply issue. And I have spoken to quite a few estate agents, and they just don't have enough people coming forward to sell their house, rather than insufficient demand in the market.
Okay, Conor, then over to you. The question made you squirm last time.
Yeah, so I suspected this is a question that I might get asked today. And just to build on one of the points that Gareth made around that almost breaking down in the economic relationship with house prices, and I think that perhaps been the feature of 2020 is because when we spoke about this last year, we were thinking, what's the impact on house prices going to be coming out of the economic shock of this pandemic? And we have had the deepest contraction in GDP in I think about 300 years or so, that the estimate is across the UK. We have a fairly broad consensus that unemployment is going to rise. The time at when it's going to happen has pushed out, and the scale at which it's going to happen has pushed out, but there's a fairly broad consensus view that unemployment is going to increase. And we've been going through a global pandemic, which has had impacts on confidence factors, but yet house prices have continued to rise, and the market actually has remained relatively buoyant. And some of the survey data for the start of 2021 would suggest that that's actually still the case. And in the past, when I thought about house prices, and when most economists think about house prices, we take it back to those economic factors of supply and demand. And we think about housing supply and about how things like access to finance, like uncertainty, like earnings growth, like wider economic activity are going to impact the demand side of that equation, and then think through about the impact on prices. Over this last year or so, we've seen other, perhaps more societal and personal factors play a role there. So, as Gareth said, there's been some anecdotal evidence about people looking to move out of cities and things. There's also been a question of people reevaluating what they want out of their homes, whether they want some outdoor space or garden space, whether they need a room in their house where they can work from, if they're going to be working from home at least a bit more often than they thought they would have done. And I think it's also a fact that there's a number of people will have come through this last year. They will have continued to work. They won't have been on furlough. They will have built up savings over this last year, and they may have decided to use some of those savings as a deposit or to help them move home. So there have been other factors that have come into play there. As we look forward, I think in the short term, over the next few months, the housing market will continue to perform relatively strongly. We've also, of course, got the extension of the stamp duty holiday announced in the budget. I was funny reading alongside the budget when the OBR gave their outlook for house prices, and they expect a modest contraction actually in the latter part of 21 and 2022. To me, that probably seems a sensible assumption as some of those economic fundamentals start to reassert themselves in the housing market. If unemployment does go up as we suspect it to, as the uncertainty around the pandemic plays a bit of a role, as the stamp duty holiday comes to an end, as some of the catch-up activity from the initial lockdown comes to an end, and we start to adjust back to a more normal housing market, some of those economic fundamentals may slow the progress of the market and lead perhaps to a modest fall in house prices. I don't think we're going to see anything like what we saw previously during the financial crisis. If there is a fall, I suspect it will be a relatively modest one, but it's very uncertain at the minute. I would almost say that the housing market is almost more difficult to predict than the wider economy at the minute, because it's not just economic factors we're having to think about, it's other ones as well. So could we see a slowdown later in the year? Yes, we could. But on the flip side of that, might we see a continued strong performance? We could as well. So much depends on how much the market pivots back to the economics driving it, and of course what the performance of the economy that links through to that is going to be. So it's a tough one to call.
Thank you. And then Neil, building on that, we're questioning around, do we think this is the time to look to using collaborative spaces in our regional towns to try and build the economic activity in those up and make us less Belfast centric? I wonder if you have any views on that.
Yes, certainly the point about this idea of collaborative spaces is being very widely discussed now globally, really. Even at a simple level, think about the new idea of public sector hubs. We typically have a building for each department in the economy, but actually just having a public service office where you can go in local to your home and be alongside colleagues from other government departments. Not only does that help from a sustainability for a commuting point of view, but what it also does is get some of that cross-pollination of ideas. And we're seeing more and more firms becoming more comfortable being alongside what they would have seen as competitors in the past. A little bit more of collaboration taking place and a little bit more of well, actually that speaks to some of the diversity of thought and different perspectives I'd like. But there's a limit to that. There are things from a security point of view that you have to keep very closely controlled. You also have a level of connection that firms want their staff to have to their firm personally. You want to share things. You worry about people communicating or talking about things. If you're bidding against another company for some tender and that person could be working opposite you in the collaborative space. So there are limits to what that can do. But certainly the idea of having very well spec'd office places that people can go into could be part of that strategy that's being really thought about what sort of place are regional towns and cities going to become. We've had a lot of conversation about the retail footprint changing, about them being more places to meet, to collaborate, to be entertained, to socialize, to live perhaps. And that's going to be a big lively debate going forward. But I think one of the things I would take away from this, going back to the diversity point, is that for the advice for local places is to really try to project their own unique identity. What we're learning more and more is not everything works for everybody. So not everyone wants to work all the time at home or all the time in the office. Some people need peace and quiet to do work. Some people find the buzz of an office or people around them actually helps. Colleagues in EY have said to me that their productivity improved at the early part of lockdown because they didn't have me coming over to their desk all the time to annoy them with some economic rant. And then some of them, and I know this is hard to believe now, say they actually miss some of that because it provided some ideas. Now that concept of, well, how we feel immediately when something happens evolves and changes. Our own mental health or view of where we need to be working, who do we need to be with, changes from week to week and month to month. So in answer to the question, I do think there is a re-imaging of towns and cities that can provide. People won't want to go back to a difficult commute. People will look for different opportunities and choices. But I think we've got to be clear, there's still a limit to that, and there's still lots of activities in which we clearly, depending on the business unit, need people from the team to be beside each other together. So I don't think that will end in its entirety. And one final point on that flexible working is it's all very well and good now to be talking about embracing that fully, as most firms are doing, EY included. But what you run the risk of is you don't have the commute on the Fridays and the Mondays because everyone wants to work at home on Friday and Monday for a period over a weekend. And then that doesn't change things on Tuesday, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and you still need the same office footprint. So there'll come some more challenges in managing that flexibility that aren't as apparent now when we talk in the theoretical about being time and space agnostic as to how people work. And of course, we can think of factories, we can think of hospitals, we can think of schools where there's very clear need for everyone still to be in again. And I think most people have recognized, even within HE, but certainly for young people's education, there's a proximity needed there too. So a bit of a re-imaging and a rethinking, certainly. But I think, as was Conor mentioned, it's going to be a bit of a hybrid. That's going to be the key word. Little bits of change, but some real re-embracing of things that we missed greatly from 2019.
Mark, just on that as well, and the collaborative spaces idea, I'm a little bit concerned about it. On one level, I think it's a really cool idea. It's the sort of idea someone like me came up with, which is obviously fantastic. But I just wonder the extent to which staff have been consulted on this. So at the minute, there's two places to work. You can work at home or you can work in your office. Now we're going to move to 3 places. So you can work at home, you can work in a collaborative space in your nearest town, or you can work in your office. And there's part of me just thinks that I'll either work at home or I'll work in the office. I don't need to go to some other collaborative space. I get the commuting piece, but if I don't want to do the commute that day, I'll stay at home. There's a lot. It just seems to me that it's come out of an ideas factory somewhere, and I don't know the extent to which it'll work in practice. It's going to require significant investment, and I would just like to see the evidence that it would be used. I think there's a risk they could become white elephants. Sorry to put a downer on that, because there's something about the idea that I do that.
Okay, no, thank you. We're starting to run out of time today, so I'm keen that as we wrap up, we hear from each of you and what your key takeaway is for the economies over the past 12 months and how you build back stronger. Now, only a minute 90 seconds each, which I know might be a challenge for all of you, but keen to hear. And I don't know, we'll maybe go to Conor first.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I suppose what I would say is that we've gone through a really challenging year on a personal and an economic level over the last 12 months or so. Hopefully we're at the stage where we can have some cautious optimism as the vaccine program rolls out and as coronavirus case numbers come down as we start to reopen our economy. And we do have that cautious optimism there at the minute as we build back, and hopefully we will see the economic recovery really take hold. There's still risks out there. We have to be aware of that. We have to be thinking about that. But I suppose I hope if we are having this conversation again in 12 months' time, that we're not still talking about the pandemic and that our focus might be shifting to some of those things in Northern Ireland that we've been trying to tackle before, like skills issues, like boosting productivity, like lowering inactivity, and getting us back to some of those challenges which tackling and successfully tackling would really help Northern Ireland as we move through this decade. So that's my hope for in a year's time, is that we have this discussion around how we really help Northern Ireland build back better and grow over the next 10 years, and not the challenges that we've just gone through.
Thank you, Conor. Neil, then?
Yeah, I think my main hope would be that as we look forward, remember the economy is the economy that and society that we craft. It's not just about what you're given. So the behavior that all of us have and what we spend, how we do those things, go out and, spend money, go out for a meal, spend time in restaurants, go to entertainment venues again when it's safe to do so, because that's part of driving the economic recovery. Be sympathetic and empathetic to those who've had a very, very difficult time, but the spending choices we make might help improve the economic recovery for them. And then I hope that what this does is allow us to really, as Conor says, take the experience of the last 12 months and say, what's the next tough question to ask as a society? And let's put the same energy and enthusiasm into solving that problem. There really is a lesson, if we think about this, about what can really be done when we consider the problem to be big enough.
And finally, Mark, yeah, I suppose what's my takeaway and what I want to see focused on. I'm going to go back to, I guess, there's huge opportunities out there, and that's going to require significant change in mindsets from quite a few people, and that change in mindset and ability to embrace those opportunities will require investment in skills, and that'll include young people, encouraging them to stay in education for as long as possible, and making that, incentivizing that as much as possible, and not making it a cost as much as possible. I think we look at things like there's assured skills programs and academies out there that have fantastic reputations, and provide opportunities for people who historically would have perhaps studied a course that they can't find a job in back then. This could be for people who found a good job, or what they thought was a good job in a secure sector, but actually that hasn't materialized, and so they need to reskill. And also support for employers to encourage them to invest in their staff and young people, and to continue to recruit, because what we noticed after the financial crisis was a lot of firms, particularly that have high levels of skills requirements, a lot of firms cut their recruitment, and then 2-3 years later, whenever they were entering into growth mode, they didn't have the skills and didn't have the labour resource to take that forward. So it's about creating an environment where businesses and consumers have confidence to invest and spend money moving forward.
Okay, thank you to all our contributors today, to Conor, Neil and Gareth, and to all those who put questions into us. Let's hope when we do reconvene in a year's time, we're talking about the significant uptrend in the economy and how the rapid vaccinations that we have seen have a real impact. And we're not talking about a 2-year-on webinar. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Continue to stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.